As Matt said, my name is Al Coates, and I am. Well, how do I define myself? Really, that's really, really peculiar. Because in some ways, the question is, how did I get to be sat in front of you guys today? It's a big group of people, 90 plus people, and I suppose if people will bear with me, I think I'd like to tell a bit about my story and my family's story, because that actually is the genesis of how I became, Al Coates, social worker. So my wife and I, well, I guess before we start that, the caveats to everything. If people have questions, it'd be really helpful for people to put them into the chat. So just put them in the chat. I've asked Matt, and there's Monica and Jane are around as well, to look through the questions and see if we can theme them together, to ask, you for them to then ask them and sort of bring them together, and I'll hopefully be able to answer them. If people have got questions, if you don't, that's absolutely fine. Hope they'll answer them as I go. But also today I was asked sort of to speak specifically through the lens of adoption and fostering and kinship care, which is probably the main reason why people have come. Now, I guess the caveat to all of that is that's the genesis of my story is adoption. But what I have found as time has gone on is that I have been drawn into this world and really seen that as much as it may be a really prevalent and observable issue in adoptive families, it's actually, and it's probably there's a higher prevalence, as a percentage wise of adoptive families, but actually in terms of scale across the broader community, the impact of aggressive, violent, challenging behavior in children is seeps into so many other corners and so many other aspects of people's lives. So today my hope is to really unpick and maybe show some aspects of this that are really specific to adoption, fostering, and kinship care. And I sort of group those three things together. They're very different, but they have some common threads. And as people are listening, and maybe that isn't necessarily the families that you're working with, but I think there are some very transferable. But there are some transferable aspects to that, and that's hopefully what we'll do. So I'm going to start at the beginning. I'll not put my slides up because you've probably seen enough slides to last a lifetime. In the last 4 years, we've done nothing but look at slides on screen. So I will refer to my slides, and the slides I'll send through to Jane and Matt at the end, and people can take them. I tend to kind of put more information on the slides than I am actually sharing, just to kind of make them a bit interesting if you're looking at them afterwards. So my story is that I am I kind of consider myself just to be a normal guy. I haven't been a social worker particularly long, 10 years. I mean, I'm 52. So I came to social work quite late in life. And how I got there is sort of slightly peculiar. And in some ways, I was precipitated by my children's experience, my children and their impact on us. So 1999, my wife and I, we adopted 3 children, and that was just part of our journey. We hadn't particularly been infertile, but we struggled to have children. We didn't want to go down the IVF route, so what we did is we adopted 3 children. Now, I think what is really interesting, and this is a phenomena that I increasingly see, is that people who've got kids that respond well to standardized parenting models, they sort of they start to can lure themselves into this belief that they're really good at parenting, and that actually that potentially it's just that they've got children who respond well to the kind of the universal models of parenting that we have. So that's a really complicated start. But, I often joke when I do work with families, I do all kinds of different things in groups, and I kind of go, the people who are often offering these wonderful, consequences, boundaries, reward charts, they're the parents of children who respond to that. But if children don't, then people find themselves adrift. So 99, my wife and I, we adopted 3 children, and they were a week off, 6, 3, and 20 months. And with hindsight, I can see an awful lot more than I saw at the time. But what I saw was those were children who were very biddable, children who were very compliant, who just were quite, they were just, I'm reluctant to use the phrase, but they were normal in terms of their behavior, that they responded well to praise, and they responded well to kind of, having a discussion about poor behavior. Really good. So within 4 or 5 years of that, 6 years maybe, in 2007, my wife and I said we would we decided we'd foster, because we're not busy enough as it is. So we decided to foster, and a long story short, and there is a long story, but we were invited to, we were actually, the panel was quite worried about us and said, oh, you're just the kind of people who want to just adopt babies and, you know, like foster babies and adopt them. And we said, no, 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 that's not us. And they said, well, just to be careful, we're not going to give you babies. But fostering being what it is, within 2 weeks, there was a 3-month-old and a 15-month-old in the house, which is exactly what they'd said wasn't going to happen. But what became really clear to me was that actually these children were very different. And they were cut from very different cloth. And within 2 or 3 years, the plan was to foster short term, and they were going to be returned to their biological family. But that plan didn't work out for a whole host of complicated reasons. But in the process of being in the care systems, I mean, thank God for the care system, but I wouldn't wish it upon anyone. It's a brutal system for a lot of children. Even when everything goes well, it's still a pretty brutal system. And these little girls, a long story short, is that we were asked to adopt them, and the biological family were in agreement to that. So 3 years later, we adopted these two little girls. But what was really clear is that if I'm being honest, we weren't coping. And that's a really complicated conversation. How do you, as a fully functioning adult, by then I was maybe mid-30s, late 30s, I worked in construction, you know, I was a project manager for a small architectural metalwork firm. And I remember having this conversation in terms of the behavior of one of my children with a social worker. I invited the social worker in, post-adoption support social worker came in, and I said, you know, something's not going to plan here with this 3-year-old. And they looked at me and I said, and I sort of tentatively started to have this conversation where I suggested that I wasn't coping. Just a bit of a complicated conversation, mid-30s. I've got a track record of doing quite well with 3 children who were kind of all appropriate. And they looked at me, and I remember a social worker saying, well, maybe the child is picking up on your anxiety. Now, needless to say, I was in the fortunate position of not having to invite them back, and I just thought, that doesn't help me. So what I looked at was a 3-year-old who would get up every night at 5 o'clock in the morning and would demand to be with her adoptive mum, her mum, as she saw it. And if she wasn't able to get to her, she would scream and shout, which is not unusual for 3-year-olds. But if she didn't get what she wanted, she would then start to throw things. And then she would start to bite and she would start to scratch. So this really complicated picture of what was, you know, toddlers are pretty robust little individuals, and violence and aggression within toddlers is quite normal, but it's toddlers. So it's not necessarily, you know, it's a rite of passage for all parents, is that toddlers, they get frustrated. They then express that in, they'll call you poo head or silly face, or, you know, they'll use language that's, you know, is hardly offensive, but the intent is there. And they'll kick you in the shin. But this little 3-year-old that I was looking after, her behavior, she would rage for not just 10 minutes or an hour even. She would rage for 2 or 3 hours. That actually every night for 6 months, she would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and attack the person that she came to first. How do I, as an adult, as a 35-year-old, express that? Because actually I reached a point where my nerves were on edge. I'm losing sleep. And I'm really struggling to communicate this to professionals, because I'm just kind of out of my depth. And also I'm a grown man and she's 3. How do I tell people that I'm not coping? Because even now, when people come to me as a, you know, professional, having walked this path, people come to me and go, well, they're 3 and I'm a bit worried. I'm not really managing their behavior. I can't be in my back. There's a voice in the back of my head that says, well, they're 3 and you're an adult. Just sort it. You're meant to be in control. And we have these paradigms within, I think, most cultures, especially Western cultures, that parents are in charge and children do as they're told. And the minute we step off of that paradigm, we start to get into really complicated territory. And I'm sure there's lots of people here who've been parents, and you'll know that yourself. That, have you ever been in a position where a child has said no to you? And you've looked them in the eye and you've said, well, yes. And they've said, no. And you've said, well, if you don't, then this will happen. And they've said, no. And you've raised your voice and they've raised their voice back. And that is a really debilitating place to be, because our whole basis of our parenting is grounded on this notion that children do as they're told. that the adults are in charge and make responsible decisions and children comply. When I was a child, that's what I did. My mother, my mother could look across a room and give me a look that made me stop doing whatever I was doing. So my experience of being parented was that dynamic was really, really embedded into who I was, that I would tell a child to do something and they would do it, which worked for my first three children. But this little 3-year-old would look at me and go, no. Now, um, that's actually quite a frightening place to be as a parent, because sometimes the things we're saying no about, sometimes it's, can I have more Peppa Pig ham? No, you can't. Sometimes it's stop doing that because it's unhelpful or it's dangerous or you're going to get into trouble. And the child says no. Really complicated dynamic. So as a family, we started to unravel, and my child's behavior over this 6-month period became to the point where I was still working full time, and there came a day and I sat down with my wife, Paula, and I said, look, she started to have panic attacks, and she's not, I'm not saying there's a type of person who has a panic attacks, because there isn't, but she started to have panic attacks and she's not that type of person. And then I started to have panic attacks and I'm not that kind of person. Now, again, forgive my language, but that's how I saw it. Like this absolute uncertainty about that feeling like my bucket is full and overflowing, and actually a 3-year-old has the dynamics in this house is that we're all tiptoeing around a 3-year-old, that we're all trying to get them to do what we want. And who do I tell? Because I'm 30, whatever I was, 36, 37. Where do I go for help? Because it's the 3-year-old. My mother thought, everyone's got a good opinion about boundaries and reward charts. This little girl, my little daughter, would eat reward charts. Literally, she would rip them up just to have no impact upon her. So it came a moment where I sat down with my wife and I said, look, I can't function. I can't function at work. My mind is totally, if the phone rings, I've got a knot in my stomach because it's you, and there's a worry that the other children in the house, there's a household of 5 children now, that they're all impacted. They all dance around this child who's got really complicated needs. And some of that behavior was kind of reflected in the younger child as well, who's now sort of 18 months too. And this is long-winded. This all will make sense. I promise you. I will get to my slides. Don't worry, unless you're worried about slides. I just gave up work. And I said, I don't know how we're going to earn a living. I don't know what I'm going to do. But I do know that if we don't do something, that we as a family, we are going to cave in, because it'd start to consume every aspect of our family life in a way that seemed really, looking back now, it was a really dark place for us as a family. So that set me on a slightly different journey. So me being at home meant that we could manage. Now, we were never able to kind of resolve my daughter's behavior, but we were able to manage my daughter's behavior. And there's lots of aspects of that, which I'm not necessarily going to now. But then within a few years, I realized there was a bit like sort of scratching around for money every month and, doing bits of this and bits of that. Then I realized there was a bursary to become a social worker. It was £4,000 a year at the time. And I thought, well, that'll do. And it's, so it's a terrible reason to become a social worker, but I became a social worker and I was quite interested. And I think my experience of social work had been really positive, apart from you're picking up on, is your child picking up your anxiety? So I qualified in 2013. In the midst of all that, another little child came along. So the mother of the 2 younger children had another baby, and my wife bumped into the auntie in Asda car park, and the auntie said, "Hey, mother's pregnant. Would you have the baby?" And my wife went, "Of course we would." Now that's not how it works. And don't worry, there was no baby there was no sort of like secret baby being in the back of a car at Asda. And then the day I qualified, my youngest daughter moved in. She's 12 now. But what I realized, so I'm a qualified social worker at that point, and I realized that actually still there was no effective solutions for this, that no one was talking about this. And I started a blog. I wrote lots of blogs, and I wrote one blog called Hurt about this really complicated dynamic where my daughter's behavior continued to be difficult. And my daughter, I remember one day she picked up a chair to throw through our front room window, and I stopped her, but then I stopped myself, and I thought, I'm not sure what to do at this point. Because again, in every other family, or so I thought, every other family in the country, if a 7-year-old picked up a chair to put through the front room window, the parents would go, "Stop it," and the child would. But my daughter wouldn't. Those normal lines and boundaries were just not available to my daughter. And I rang social services. I rang my duty. I think the not the duty, I rang my post-adoption support worker and I said, look, this is what's happening. Can you teach me to hold my child in a way that's safe? Because actually that's wholly appropriate that I stop my child damaging property. And also, there's not a person here who wouldn't stop their child breaking things in their house. You would, it's an absolute, it's a given. If a child picked up something and they were about to smash it, you'd say, stop. Or you'd put your hand in and you'd grab it. And I didn't feel like I could do that because of the kind of the specific nature of my daughter. And the social worker said to me, she said, well, we don't believe in restraint, Mr. Coates. And I said, well, I'm not looking to restrain my child. I'm looking to stop her from breaking stuff and hurting people. Because in the midst of all that, there's still lots of physical lashing out. And she said, absolutely, but we don't believe in restraint, Mr. Coates. And I said, right, are you stuck on a feedback loop? Because I'm not. Tell me what to do, because why are you suggesting that I just let my child? Well, Mr. Coates, we don't believe in restraint. I said, I know you don't, but teach me how to hold her safe so I can keep her safe. Got into this huge pickle, and I just wrote this angry blog that exploded. And from that explosion, I'm here. So I will unpick a bit more of that story, but actually realizing that me as a capable functioning adult, that my whole world could be unraveled by this very small person who totally broke the system. The normal, the non-spoken agreement that there is in society is that parents are responsible for children and children respond well to that. It's what I did. It's probably what you did. And there are moments where that's challenged. So, toddlers are challenging, and adolescents, I mean, we all get to adolescence, and we understand that because we were all adolescents. We all slammed the door and said, I can't believe you're not letting me go out in that dress or shoes or hat or whatever. Or why wouldn't you? We've all had that experience, and that's normal. But we're talking about families where that experience is times 10, times 100, times 1,000, but also it's outside of those normal developmental phases. And so there's some really interesting research, or some interesting thinkings, probably not research about it, thinking about, well, is it that children, do children learn to be violent? Or is it that some children don't learn to be peaceful? It's a really complicated notion that sometimes, there's some interesting research I read recently that came out of the USA, and it's of a very relatively small cohort of children. But the biggest predictor in this cohort of children around violent and aggressive behavior was actually it wasn't the kind of the sort of the cultural things that we would think about. They'd witnessed violence or they experienced violence. Actually, it was around neglect. And the hypothesis being that toddlers who are not taught how to be peaceful remain violent. So in that moment when children are not being supported, and we're speaking specifically about children in adoption, fostering, and kinship, that we see they're a cohort of children who have had very specific experiences in terms of their early life, in terms of their experience of adversity, and both before they were born and both after they were born. I can share, I'm sure my children wouldn't mind me sharing that my children, before they were born, experienced how they experienced, is open to kind of interpretation, but they experienced violence and aggression from their mother, who was a perpetrator of violence and also a victim of violence. So a very complicated dynamic that a lot of children grew up into. I've not even got to my slides yet. That's slightly worrying, isn't it? Anyway, right, okay. Let's do the slide thing. I've told you a little bit about myself. So from that position of me being a social worker, the doors opened really, and I just saw that there was this absolute absence of conversations around this topic. And so what I sort of set up to do with Dr. Wendy Thorley, who was an amazing resource to me. She's also a fellow adoptive parent, and she spoke to me, and we decided just off, like, this is totally, it's totally back of a fag packet, one December morning. I said, I'm just going to find out what people are saying about this stuff. So I set up a Survey Monkey. I got a free account, and it got to about, and Wendy said, well, what you're doing, you need to pay for it. I went, oh, only 5 or 6 people will get in touch. We went over within about a week. There'd been 200 plus respondents to what was our original survey in 2017. It's still on Academia Edu. You can see it on my website, which is alcoats.u.uk. There's some information there about where you can get me. I'm on Facebook. I post loads of stuff. I also do Twitter because I'm down with the kids, or X as it's known. And I've got my own podcast, which is the Adoption and Fostering Podcast, which is available from all major people. If you want to email me, info@alcoats.co.uk. I'm available for weddings, funerals, confirmations, bar mitzvahs. I'll do anything. So I think that that this whole area is absolutely fascinating, because my experience was that once we started to open the gates, the floodgates, that actually what became that people are often just overwhelmed at the fact that someone's even speaking about it. And as much as I'm, I'd like to think that I'm clever and articulate and, full of wisdom, oftentimes the response people give to me is that you're just talking about it. And I just feel like you're sharing my experience. And that's probably the one of the biggest, the biggest compliments I get, that actually I am just sharing some of that lived experience. So what I'd like to do is to put you into groups. I have no idea how to put you into groups. Yes, I do. I should know how to do that. And I want to ask you I want to put you into really small groups and give you 5 minutes. I want to ask you the question, in terms of the families that you're working with, how would they define this behavior? How would they describe it? What would they say is going on in their families? Because oftentimes people will say, well, they do this, and that. But how would they articulate that to you? What do they think is actually happening in terms of the needs of their children, or why children are behaving a certain way? So I'm going to I'll find my share button if I can find it. Oh, there it is, stop share. So I want you to go in. I'm going to put you into groups for about 3 minutes. How many people? It's 92 people. So that's 10 groups, isn't it? Yeah, in groups of about 10. And what I'd like you to do is just have that conversation in terms of just, really quickly, 3 people in a group. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes. And I want you to say, well, just specifically the families that you're working with or supporting or know of, or maybe your own experience, what do you think is actually going on in terms of the children's behavior? Why do you think this behavior is happening? So does that make sense? Nod for yes. Yeah, everyone's nodding. That's cool. So I'm going to fire you off into Cannes. I'm going to come back at 1:15. Here you are. So, okay, then I'll ask you. So how the families that you're working with, how would they define this behavior? What do they think is going on?
I think obviously there's always you get a wide range of answers, but something that comes up a lot, I think, is something that I hear so many times from a lot of our families is that parents saying, well, they just want to do what they want to do, and they think
Right.
it's a simple answer of, well, they just don't want to do anything they don't want to do, kind of thing. It's quite a very simplistic um idea, and I think quite quickly normally after about 15 minutes we start looking at it from different angles, and we can work out, right, it's not a simple fact of, oh, I just don't want to do that, so I'm going to smash this window, or break
Yeah.
this, whatever it might be. um but then I think it's quite often we get to see that there's always underlying reasons, and there's always some pain or some difficulty that isn't being addressed or hasn't been noticed enough by those important adults around child. I think is
Right.
what kind of starts coming up quite quickly for a lot of families, where they start looking at things from the child's perspective, and recognizing, they do find this really tough, and this is a real, and we look through the past, and often, it's quite upsetting for parents, because that they recognize their children have been through really traumatic events at times, um, and there's been no support there to help that child. I often say, well, what support did they get through school? What other support was available to them? Nothing. We just kind of brushed it under the carpet and carried on. Um, so I think that's something that often that comes up with parents, where they recognize that. Um, but yeah, it's like I said, there's so many different reasons, though.
But well, yeah, is there or is there not? And I think that's the complication, isn't it?
Mm,
Is it an incredibly complicated issue, or is it a really simple issue?
mm,
Um, and it all, and I think that, like you said, that actually the needs of the child not being met,
mm,
and that I think that sometimes a lot of the families, that I think as a family, that's really hard to accept.
Yeah.
Or that there's a parenting deficiency. Ooh, guilty. That's a complicated phrase, but I'll keep my powder dry for when everyone
Yeah.
comes back. Um, does anyone else want to share anything in terms of what their families might be saying? Bennett or Diane?
A lot of
Oh, Diane.
resentment. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, no, go for it, Bennett.
Oh, I was going to say, there's often a lot of resentment, like people who've stepped into. So I work for kinship, so not sort of birth parents, but people who have stepped into the breach for this child, who have sacrificed a lot for this child, and obviously that's not the child's fault, but it does
Yeah.
sometimes kind of when the child isn't behaving as within what is perceived as an acceptable range of problematic behaviors. And there's not gratitude there, that can kind of
Yeah.
cause
Because
a lot of resentment.
that word gratitude is really interesting, isn't it? Because we all kind of go, ooh, but if that's how you feel, that's how you feel. That's really complicated, and so that's fascinating. Diane, you were on mute, so you were about to say something.
I'm on a phone and I'm finding this really difficult. For me, we met some time ago. I worked for a domestic abuse agency, but I've just gone independent. For me, it's placing the blame upon the victim of domestic abuse, the non-abusive parent, and that anger towards the non-abusive parent is what I say. And for me, so I work as a counsellor, but I also manage the children and young people's team. And the referrals for our males were always from kind of professionals. I'm worried he is going to turn into his dad, i.e. perpetrator. And for our females, were always based more about the anxiety that child experienced. But actually, the male was experiencing anxiety, and it was that was coming out in anger. Yeah. So
that's really interesting, and that's good. And because I think that my experience is that I've seen people say that exact thing, that the partner who's sort of experiencing the violence sees that sees their partner, their abusive partner, mirrored in their child. Oh, that's just so really, really complicated. I think everyone is almost back now. We've got everyone. Let's just crack on. That was probably chaos. I threw you into the internet, then dragged you all back and then threw you back out. It's like some sort of terrible MCU multiverse world that we've created. But without the fun or popcorn. So is anybody, there's not a lot of time and there's lots and lots of people here, but I'm gonna say a few things that we reflected on. One was Matt, what was something Matt was saying? So obviously Matt is spread across a diverse client group, talking about children just doing what they want to do. That actually that lack of boundary, that lack of ability to bring to bear any sort of authority, or no natural authority being in place. Well, they just do what they want. They just do, that they're unable to. We also had, we just briefly, because you came in there, we were talking about domestic abuse, but also we were talking about kinship, families, kind of seeing sometimes a lack of gratitude was the issue for families where, other adults of the family had stepped in to sort of support children, to care for them and bring them into the household, but then feeling a lack of gratitude. So lots of really complicated reasons. Is there anything that anybody, I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes, but is there anybody who want to add anything to that? I'm just looking through there. There's so many of you that it's almost, you're all going, no, someone else will say something. Someone else will say something. Well, I said no one's answering. I will just crack on. And but I think it's really interesting. And I think probably if I could anticipate of being in one of the 30 groups, because there's a lot of groups, is that actually there's probably every family, as much as we can theme it, we can bulk it into themes. Every family probably has a very different experience. and probably sees it differently. And I think that's one of the things that I've found absolutely fascinating in terms of this world, is that oftentimes families sort of understand what is going on, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes it's about helping them, because they're in the middle of what is a very, very stressful environment. Their ability to see clearly can sometimes be hugely impacted by that. So I'm going to rattle off a few things. So there's a few things that I would like to share with you guys in terms of not right, precise. So I think the first thing is that a lot of times families are operating on the basis of they know what good parenting looks like. Most people do. Now I know there's exceptions to that, and there'll be people who there'll be families that we're working with that are on the very fringes of that. But on the whole, most people do, and I think that's where people are really confused. That actually, I'm not. The things I'm doing, I worked with other children. The things I'm doing, you know, if you're a kinship carer, the things that I'm doing worked with my other, the children that I may have raised. Recently working with a chatted, not worked with. I spoke to an 83-year-old who was raising an 11-year-old with violent aggressive behaviour, and that blows my noodles for a whole raft of reasons about. But she was looking and going, but my other children are all okay. And she sort of stepped in for one child who had very specific needs. So really complicated. And I think as professionals, at the heart of what we do is this really difficult question in terms of when we walk into a house, and often it's like a bowl of spaghetti. Parents or carers have got very specific views on why children are behaving a certain way. And we have to make these assessments really quickly to try and make sense of what is going on. And, you know, oftentimes what we observe is that the system, the parent carer, isn't doing very well. The impact of that, the impact of living in that environment, and that sort of sense of undermining, that sense of being outside of the norms, can be really debilitating for them, and it can have a whole impact. So that is oftentimes the initial thing we see that parents and carers are struggling. But then in the midst of all that, sometimes we've got complicated children. Sometimes we've got complicated parents and complicated children. And in the midst of all that, we're stepping into it. And if anyone's familiar with the author Gita Sareni, who wrote a fantastic book about Mary Bell, who was a child murderer, it's all got a bit serious very quickly, hasn't it? She wrote a really interesting book about a Nazi war criminal who got off with it. And she said this idea that sometimes people know things are going on, but they choose to look away. And I think families' experience of professionals is sometimes that we come in, or professionals come in, and it's just too difficult to look at. So sometimes the responses they've had from other professionals, be that a GP, be that, you know, different health professionals, be that CAMS or SIPs, be that school, be that social work, be that police, that professionals look into that world and go, this is too complicated. And then roll the clock forward a year, 6 months, whatever, 2 years, 5 years, then we rock up. And we're trying to unpick this bowl of spaghetti where is the parent's behavior impacting on the child, and the child's behavior impacting on the parent? Where did this all start? And we're being asked really complicated questions in terms of that. And I think as well, in terms of how families define it, I think is really interesting. I've got a list of different definitions, and you can speak to a range of different parents in a range of different settings, and they would all probably have a different perspective. I don't want to get into definitions particularly. I have strong feelings about definitions, in the sense that I think families are allowed to define it however they want to define it. And that was borne out by my experience of undertaking surveys. So the first survey we did with, and it was predominantly adoptive parents, about 228 parents. The second survey, we then did a survey realizing that we just scratched the surface and somewhat overwhelmed, and we got over 500 responses, but that was predominantly biological parents. And one of the things that the feedback that came back to us, there were a lot of people who got in touch and said, I will not do your survey because actually I don't like how you define it. That is not my child. And our definition had been one of the sort of the Cottrell definition in terms of child who, you know, parents' behavior impacted by a child who's intentionally behaving a certain way. A lot of families say, well, I don't believe that my child intends to behave this way. Really complicated in terms of how parents conceptualize it, which means that then it's really difficult how we think, how we then support them. So you can read, these are the 2 surveys that I did. There's loads more. We did some interesting work with the police as well, and I'll maybe come back to that. But we did the Northumbria Police. We released it sort of the day before lockdown, so it never went anywhere. Nothing really happened, but it was fascinating. We worked with the police in terms of police call-outs. Right, so I'm going to get to the crux of it in terms of adoption, fostering, kinship. And I think that this is just, I was talking to Matt in our breakout room, and we were talking about how it is incredibly complicated, but sometimes it's actually really simple. It is that in terms of the risks for this behavior, fall back on these 3 key components. And that's my perspective anyway, is that the experience of children has an impact on how they behave. And the more difficult and challenging and the higher levels of early adversity, unsupported adversity, toxic trauma, if you're familiar with that sort, then impacts on a child's sense of self, how they see themselves, how they see you, how they see parents, how they see the world that they operate in, and maybe inhibit or influence how they then respond to that world. Biology, in terms of the impact of experience on biology, is kind of a well-worn path if you look at the adverse childhood experience studies and the impact of that. But also we know that children are born neurodivergent, that there's a whole, there's a whole raft of reasons why children's biology is different from other children. And then systems. So I'm going to sort of unpick some of this stuff. But I think for me, the interesting thing is when we think about the impact of on adoptive parents, kinship parents, and SEN parents. I've not put foster care there because actually my experience is that this isn't a massive issue in foster care in the way it is with other families, but so foster carers often have a lot of support around them that's structurally there. I still think it's an issue, but foster carers have some, foster carers don't necessarily have to sort of tolerate behavior in a way that other families do. Forgive me if there's foster carers in the room because they might have a different perspective. So for me, when we think about children who've experienced adoption, children who've experienced fostering, but also children who have found themselves in a kinship arrangement, there's always a reason. And there's usually high levels of early adversity. We've got when we think about we've got the ACEs, the 10 ACEs, that children who've experienced high levels of physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, children who come through the care system, the predominant reason why children are in the care system is neglect, failure to keep children safe by their biological parents. And then these children then enter into the care system, which often involves separation, loss, bereavement, chronic loss for a lot of children where it's not a bereavement, where there's a death, it's a loss that they're separated from people that they love, and that's unresolvable. In terms of thinking about ourselves, often I think that when we think about children who have experienced adversity, the manifestation of their distress can often look like poor behavior. And that is really complicated for the caregivers and the professionals around that child, that actually a child who is irritable and angry, well, if I was separated from the people I love, I would be irritable and angry. Totally understandable behavior, but in a child, that's a problem. So really complicated in terms of children's experience. And we know that in terms of adoption, the latest figures from Adoption UK's barometer was that 66% of families reported having experienced violence and aggression at some point during their child's childhood. So 66%, that's 2/3, give or take. And that is a lot of children. Now, the survey that we did in 2018 was really interesting because we asked people about the age of their children. And again, this wasn't just adoptive parents, but this was all parents. And what came back was really interesting because I think when we think about children with challenging, violent, aggressive behavior, we think about, our minds go to sort of adolescents, complicated teenagers and toddlers. But what the evidence showed, or what the results showed, was that actually there was a higher prevalence in mid-childhood. So yes, there was people who reported really struggling with 3-year-olds, like I was struggling, but those 3-year-olds become 7, 8, 9-year-olds. And actually that's where there was the highest peak in terms of people struggling children's behavior, which I think is really fascinating, because if you think in terms of adoptive parents, their journey to adoption involves social work. And so that they probably have positive experiences of social work, positive interactions, positive links into social work. So there's also, I think, a really specific phenomena in adoption as well, is that as a adoptive parent, you can quite rightly put your hands up and go, this isn't me, this is the child you brought me. So I think that adoption is the tip of the spear in this sphere, because the adoptive parents don't necessarily feel blame and shame the way that other parents do. Now, I'm not saying that they don't. So, you know, if there's any adopters in here, please don't throw stones. But I think that there's a legitimate route to say, actually, this is the child that came. The adversity that they experienced is not, I am not the author of that adversity. It's nothing to do with me. I'm just trying to support this child who's experienced adversity. So then there's quite a clear or an open door to have that conversation. Now, I still think there's barriers to that, because I think people still feel high levels of shame and isolation. But for adoptive parents, that's different. And so I think for in adoption, you will find adoptive parents will be accessing support at an earlier age, at this 7, 8, 9 peak. Then what we found in the 2018 survey we did, that then lessens off, and then it sort of 12, 11, 12, 13, and then at 13, 14, 15, it kind of rises again, but it never gets as high as the middle childhood. So really interesting in terms of how the systems that we have around families are built. They're all sort of focused on what is understandably what we all sort of anticipate, and we kind of can accept, and we can all have a level of empathy with the frustrated teenager, because we've all been teenagers. And we can quite easily stretch into that and go, well, yeah, I understand that this is not that, but it's something, but it's an extension of that, or that's the foundation it's built off. So adoptive parents often find themselves coming to the attention of services much earlier, because of all of those really complicated reasons. But I think the services we've got, that you can't necessarily, that what would work with a 15-year-old wouldn't necessarily work with a 7-year-old. And I think the reason that other families don't necessarily bring their 7-year-olds to the attention of services or seek help or seek support is because actually you can contain a 7-year-old. It may not be pretty, it may not be ugly, but you don't necessarily feel the same level of threat of a 7-year-old that you'd feel of a 13-year-old or a 15 or a 17-year-old. So I think adoptive families inhabit this slightly peculiar world where it's a broader issue, and they're maybe more willing to stick a label on the behavior in a way that other families aren't. I think kinship is peculiar, or well, I don't say the kinship carers are peculiar. I think that it's got some really unique facets in this terms of often the authors of the early adversity are not the, you know, if you're a grandma or an uncle or an aunt or a grandfather or a, you know, older sibling, you can rightly look on and go, well, I didn't, you know, I wasn't the author of these circumstances that got me to here. But sometimes you do as well. As families, you know, that they feel a level of shame in terms of that they feel judged in terms, if you were a better mother, your daughter would not have had this child and you would not be looking after it. So really complicated levels of shame and guilt that can kind of lay over families, and you know, really, really complicated dynamics in terms of how they perceive themselves. I think kinship as well brings a different and also a very, you know, we'll move on to systems, but in terms of experience, you kind of get that. I'll keep that math powder dry. That's just a slide. In terms of biology, this is the results of what we asked in terms of for parents. So tell us about your child. Who are they in terms of do they have any diagnosis? Do they have any special additional needs? And what we saw that there was a comorbidity across a lot of children with really complex needs in terms of attachment, learning difficulties, developmental delay, FASD, which I think is a hugely under-recognized or identified issue for a lot of families, and that impacts on children's ability to process. A friend of mine who's an adoptive parent's child, often quite aggressive, quite volatile, but actually realizing that there was a processing, it was a frustration out of processing, which, but a punched wall is a punched wall. How we got there is not, it's important we know how we got there, but still a punched wall is a punched wall. ADHD, ASD, so really complicated in terms of the needs of the children. The last one I want to look at in terms of it is this idea of systems. And I think we've talked about that the adopted children, kinship children often live in slightly different circumstances to biological children. And I think kinship carers find themselves in a sort of a specific in a specific place in terms of their age. So complicated. Predominantly, it's grandparents looking after children. But what we've got there is we've got people who've maybe parented in the 70s and 80s, or maybe 90s, who have maybe got a different model of parenting as well. So as a professional, you come into a kinship family and you see that the parenting is kind of out of date. You know, that their parenting is often reactive, or there's a whole level of complexity that kinship carers are often dealing with, maybe potentially challenging behavior from their own biological children. If it's a grandparent, that there's other members of the family with complex behavior that interplay into the needs of the child. And so when we think about systems, the systems can be often really complex with how families got there, as well as what we find when we are there. If we also talk about adoptive families, I think the genesis of adoptive families is really interesting. And also when we were in our breakout room, we talked about sometimes kinship carers sort of having this feeling of the child shouldn't be behaving like this. There should be gratitude. That's someone shouting at me.
How are you? Yeah,
Hang on. Someone's on the phone to a friend. There you go. Just ordering a pizza there. So the issue is that they find themselves in these complicated dynamics. So for adoptive parents, often I don't think adopters see themselves vulnerable. I see adopters as potentially quite vulnerable generally, in that if we think back 30, 40 years, you would go, you tried for a baby, you couldn't have a baby. You went to the doctor said, you're not going to have a baby. And you then go and adopt. But now we find that adoptive parents have potentially been through quite invasive infertility treatment that may have been protracted over a number of years. And actually the impact of that is that you've got people who are inherently impacted by that. And, as the adoption process tries to not wheedle those people out, but tries to kind of ensure that isn't a kind of a really present issue, or an issue that's really kind of manifest in the home. And so the complication is that you've then got potentially parents who've got this idealized version of what child rearing is going to be, that they've got this notion of, we're going to have a child, it's going to be wonderful, we're going to live like the Waltons, it's all going to be unicorns and, and fairies and rainbow bridges to happiness. And then they've got a child who isn't playing along with that, and the sense of palpable loss. And I spoke to the Tavistock, and they were doing some work with adoptive parents around challenging behavior in their children, and actually looking at the relationships and seeing that oftentimes within adoptive families, you may have the parent who goes along with this in terms of, you wanted to adopt, I'll go along with it. And that works fine when the child is kind of fine, I say in inverted commas. But when the child stresses that, then potentially families, that relationship becomes quite fractious. So in terms of the pressure on the system, and you can see that and I think that this is where it gets really for me, this is where it gets really complicated. So the work I do is I'm an NVR practitioner, but I sort of see that in much more broader terms than just NVR. I think it's about systemic work. It's about looking at the family as a whole and seeing what are all the influences on this family unit. Oftentimes parents come to you and say, fix my child. My child won't do as they're told, make them do as they're told. That's a really broad strokes there. But actually, what I often find is that there's these huge pressures on the system. And we talk about children with special educational and needs. Adoption and kinship children have a really high prevalence in that terms. But that then across I think there's 1.4 million children with SEN. There's a lot of families in terms of children with additional needs where the behavior of that children can edge towards aggression, violence, aggression, explosive, which I think was a fantastic kind of definition by Nikki Rutter, which was at the bottom of my list, that explosive behavior. The pressure on the system of family in adoption, there can be this sense of, well, you wanted to do this. I've had people say that to us as a family, well, you signed up for this. What were you expecting? We told you. Those stereotypes about children who come from the care system. For kinship carers, the pressures from other members of the family, maybe your daughter has a drugs misuse problem and that's why you're looking after your child. but you've still got a daughter. And that can be incredibly difficult, and tensions within families in terms of how children are raised. The wider community can often bring real pressure that parents feel the need to try and care for those children and manage that behavior in a way that is acceptable by the community. My daughter shouting and screaming at me, calling me an effing whatever in the street when she's 7. Everyone's got an opinion about what I should be doing. And the danger of that is that you then sort of fall under that opinion. I give you an example. My daughter used to play football, and she was at a football tournament, and she was a fantastic footballer. There was an altercation on the pitch, and my daughter, all the girls got kind of quite fraught, and then all the parents were kind of shouting over the kids, "Hey, wind your neck in, come on, da." And I said to my daughter, "We just need to calm down." And she came over to the pitch and she ripped a shred off me in front of sort of 200 people. We all know what it's like to be watched and observed in terms of this. My child has behaved massively inappropriately. What my child needs at that moment isn't necessarily what I want to give them. They need me to step back and reassure them, but I'm absolutely hacked off. I feel embarrassed. I feel ashamed. I feel that, I feel that I need to act a certain way. And that can mean that the way people are parenting is often as a response to the people around them, not necessarily to the needs of their child. And I was talking to Matt in the breakout room, and he was saying that actually when he was talking about how parents start from a position of they won't do as they're told, but actually oftentimes in scraping back that and exploring that, you often discover that there's unmet needs in the child. And that there's things going on in that child that the parent has not necessarily observed or got access to, or even just perceived. And so really, really complicated. School is often a massive one. So we did the police, as I mentioned, we did the police survey, and we talked to, they gave us for every police call out over a sort of a year, just short of a year period, they gave us every police call out when parents had called them out due to the nature of their child's behavior. And again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to kind of have a level of empathy. I mean, there's a lot of parents here. Has anyone ever called the police on their child? And how frightened must you be, or how distressed or concerned must you be for your child's behavior to call the police on your child, no matter what they're doing? And so we got the call outs. We looked at the call outs. What was fascinating was the call outs. We looked across a year, so that included sort of Easter, half term, summer holidays, and so on. The police call outs reduced during half term and during school holidays. Now, I'm not saying that schools are to blame for children's behavior, but we know that schools can be complicated systems, and that children that sometimes children are square pegs in what is built as a round hole, and they're being hammered into it. We also know that some children sometimes mask at school, and they come out, and it's their frustration, anxiety, stress spills into absolutely just spills into the home. Really frustrating, really scary for families. So school can be a huge issue. Services, culture, circumstances, history, all of those things play into the impact on parents. And so I'm looking at the time. I could go on and on. Getting me to talk is not the trick. Getting me to stop is the real trick. Actually, I might pause at that. Matt, are you still around somewhere?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Is there any questions, anything in the chat that I need to pay attention to? Any sort of specific questions?
We've got a couple of questions.
It would now. I'll stop sharing it and jump. Is it worth asking them now? And then I'll wind. I've got maybe 20 minutes.
I'm sure we'll get more questions as well, as when people know you finished. We have one question from Bennett Klopsch, and they say, have you seen any data on epigenetic impact on behavior in this context?
Oh, now we're into the long grass, aren't we? I think this is an absolutely fascinating aspect of the work we do. So epigenetics is so if there are any brain doctors in the room, please look away now, because this is going to be awful as I mangle the science. My understanding is that epigenetics is how your body decodes your genetic structure and the impact on how your body decodes it. I think that there is Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, I think is probably the text to go to. But if you go on Amazon, there's the big version, then there's the scratch and sniff version. Get the scratch and sniff version if you're not, unless you're really clever. It's absolutely dense material. But I think that chimes with a lot of us, and we see that these ripples down through families. And also I think there was something in the news yesterday in terms of nature over nurture, which I guess speaks to that as well, and especially for the adoption community. So there's a lot of families who are, really complicated, because you see children who are being, I mean, adoption's complicated and ethically quite questionable, but you're drawing children out of communities and families, but then that behavior continues. And sort of families going, well, I've done nothing, I've got nothing. And so they've not witnessed that, they've not seen it, but there's a predisposition towards violence. There's a predisposition to having short temper. So I think absolutely the impact of early adversity on, and was it a few weeks ago? Oh, forget me. I read lots of things, then I can't remember. So I'm just sort of misquoting and mangling. There was another study that came out in terms of mothers' experiences of poor parenting, then being manifest in the experiences of children, and that even if those mothers didn't raise the children, I think it was a Californian study. And I think all of that is in the picture, that I'm not looking to let people off the hook, but I think for me, you've got to help people make sense of this. And I think we are meaning making machines. And if you can sit with a family and explain to them, the reason your child behaves like this is because of X, Y, and Z, or give them shine a light into some sort of understanding, that can often be the first step in then trying to change that system. I think the complication being that oftentimes families are living with a level of adversity that means their perception is also altered. And that's where it gets really murky. Because the reality is, and I say this it's sort of my caveat at the beginning of every session I do with families, is you may not be the author of your children's behavior, but you may have the keys to the solution. And trying to move away from that blame culture that I think is really prevalent. Families feel blamed anyway. Kinship carers feel blamed because they feel like, well, if I was a better mother, if I was a better aunt, if I was, when the minute you get into that, that's an awful position for people to be in. To imagine raising an 11-year-old whilst thinking, if I'd been a better mum 40 years ago, that's kind of a doom spiral of thinking. And how can you then lift your head up to even start to think about parenting in a different way? But similarly for adoptive parents, that to help them make sense of why a child behaves a certain way and why we're responding a certain way. And that is often for me the complexity. So I'll give an example. Is I did a session, it was 8 hours, so it was four-week sessions. It was an SEMH school. So there was a whole range, it was a really diverse community of parents. So there was kinship carers, there was foster carers, there was adoptive parents, but predominantly it was biological parents. Interestingly, so this is where we get into the really long grass, is that a lot of the parents themselves had diagnosis, and I had a mum literally in one of the sessions sobbing, going, my child has ADHD and I've got ADHD and it's my fault. There's a lot of sobbing in my sessions, and it's normally not to do with me, honestly. But what I discovered with over these 8 hours is that actually I had real clear plans of how we're going to kind of address some of the challenging behavior in the parents. But it took 7 hours to build up a level of trust and get people onto an even keel, because people were just so impacted by the behavior. And I think, that does lead on to my next slide. I'm probably going to go off slide. Is that actually when you think about the impact on the carers, they, if we think about trauma, and I think trauma is a massively overused language. So it's in pop culture. I went to the shops, I couldn't find cheese, I was traumatized, right? So that's utter rubbish. If we think about trauma in the truest sense of the language, and again, trauma isn't an event, trauma is a response to an event or events. And we think about what is trauma. So trauma can be a one-off event. And I'll give you an example of my daughter once repeated everything I said to her for 48 hours, when children do that, which is funny. It's like go to bed, don't do this, don't do that. Now, it is funny. Recounting the story is funny, but what happened was I started to unravel. After 48 hours, and it was my birthday as well. So the circumstances, everything I said, and she would have been about 11, 12, and everything I said. And I started to really, and she was dysregulating, I was dysregulating, and it was my birthday, and I'd been bought a set of carving knives. This is a bad story, isn't it? It's a window into my home life. So they were on the windowsill, so they're out of reach. But my daughter, finally, she kind of tipped over she redlined and tipped over. She ran and she got an 8-inch knife, and she put it to her chest to stab herself. And I instinctively grabbed the knife. What a stupid thing to do, because if you grab someone, and then what do? They pull towards themselves. And all of a sudden, the whole thing flashed before me, and I literally had to, in a very unpretty, non-social worky way, I got the knife off of a 12-year-old girl, which is not a good look. And I shook for 48 hours, thinking, what the hell? So now, when we think about the impact of adversity, the bubble had burst, and she was just a puddle of tears, and we picked her up and we restored and did all that kind of stuff. We repaired and restored and related and all that kind of Bruce Perry bang. But families are living with that on a daily basis. And so the impact of maybe one event can be a trauma response, but an impact of ongoing small scale events can lead to a level of trauma. So that when a child says to you, no, your response isn't that of a normal person. The response is of that of someone who is being pushed to the very edge of themselves. So we as professionals, we come into the house and we see parents screaming at children, or parents afraid to say no, or parents overwhelmed by just what seems like they just asked you what was for dinner. And we go, well, clearly the parents or the carer is lost the plot. But actually they're operating out of a high level of stress. So I will go back. So was there any other questions? Because time is ticking. Anyone you can ask me?
I see one other from Charlotte Warburton asking. She said, "I'd be intrigued to hear if you do any work with families with a child with a disability and violent behaviour that is linked to the disability."
Well, yeah, I guess I think that you would, in terms of disability, I guess you mean physical disability, but I think we can also frame some of those complex neurodivergent conditions as a disability as well. So FASD is a hidden disability. So I think there's a lot of children with hidden disabilities that we're not picking up. I haven't worked, I'm trying to think in terms of children with, I don't think I have worked with a child with a physical disability, but I would say that 9 times out of 10, I'm working with children with hidden disabilities to varying degrees. And I think that is really complicated because oftentimes, well, I think when we did the police report, a lot of families were self-diagnosing, and I don't think that's particularly helpful. I think that families are often striving for a diagnosis to make sense. But a diagnosis doesn't make any difference in terms of necessarily the support. We all work in a context where it doesn't matter. No one's coming. Really complicated. I'm going to share this screen. So I think what we see is families who are now, this is what we're seeing: people overwhelmed, helpless, hopeless, going through the motions, reactive trauma, maladaptive strategies. So again, you've got these really complicated situations where parents are staying up late. How many times do that it helps today, but if you're not getting to bed till 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning because it's the only time you get peace, the long-term impact of that is on your health, your mental health, your well-being, your capacity to manage situations. And so families slipping into maladaptive strategies. There's some fascinating research on dads hiding in car parks eating cakes. Look it up. So Mrs. says to Dad, go off and buy some milk from the shops, and he spends an extra 10 minutes sat in the car park eating a cake because it just helps. Or men taking more overtime than they need to take. People working or finding reasons not to be in the house. Relational stuff. I mean, I have got a slide. Yeah, I've got a slide. I'll move on to that. I'm going to draw on this, which is from a domestic abuse charity research. So perpetrator, I don't count as calling children perpetrators, but to be true to this research, I've used the word there. I think the danger is that ultimately adults come to this and then they start to think to themselves, I thought I was a functioning adult. And I reflect on myself. You know, I'd raised 3 children, complicated children through adoption, and I was doing great. And they were well-behaved kids I could take anywhere without even batting an eye. And then all of a sudden, I can't cope with a 3-year-old. And that happens, you know, into adulthood. I cannot cope with her behavior. That changes who I think I am. I start to see myself, whereas I saw myself as this competent, functioning adult with my stuff together, I now start to see myself as a weak. You know, I see myself as weak because I daren't say no, or I can't say no. I see myself as compromising, whereas I used to have really strong values. Now I have no values. I see myself as avoidant. I see myself as XYZ. Alterations in perception of the child, that they stop being a child and they become a perpetrator, that they stop being a child, and children are inherently vulnerable. Even if they're angry, smashy kids, they're inherently vulnerable. And the danger is that people stop seeing them as that actually, like you were saying when we were talking, Matt, we were talking that a child then starts to see themselves as, a parent starts to say, well, I'll have to ask them if they'll do that. I'll have to, which again turns the whole kind of cultural narrative upside down, that I'm frightened to say no to my child, that because they're strong, they're powerful, they have authority, they are potent, I'm impotent. They are strong, I am weak. They're in control of their lives. They get what they want, I don't get what I want. And you kind of, then all of a sudden us coming into that is really complicated. And so in some ways, for me, the start point is always the adults in the room and actually keeping them safe and trying to get their perspective. And sometimes the danger is that sometimes parents and adults have behaved really badly. If we're being honest, they've called their kids names, you know, which is inexcusable, but also totally understandable. You know, that parents have chased them around calling them little shits. And you go, that we just can't countenance that behavior. But you think the alternative is that they're thrashing the kids. And so really, we find it's a really murky area of practice, because in another world, we would say there's no way in the world that we should tolerate parents being verbally abusive to children. But parents brought to the very edge of themselves by children's behavior, and children's behavior responding to parents who are at the very edge of themselves. And this doom spiral starts to occur. And, you know, and usually, you know, what we discovered with the police research was that actually when do people come to the notice of services? It's never day one. It's never, you know, it's never the 3-year-old, or rarely it is. It's the 15-year-old who is now in control, because we've been in this doom spiral for 12 years. And the parents have finally reached a point. The fascinating bit about the research was that what is the most likely reason people called the police was because there was another child involved. And what you see so often is mums, especially mums, will absorb an almost unending amount of absolute terrible behavior. But the minute it slips onto another child, that people are having to have those very difficult conversations, and they go, well, to protect that child, I will now call the police, knowing full well that if the police come, you lose control. And you might get a good response from the police, you might get a terrible response from the police. And this Northumbria police were actually fantastic, and we had a really good conversation on that. And some of the things we came to was that actually you need to call the police the day before it gets, you know, or the week before, the month before, and so we do a lot of that stuff. So alterations in relationships to others, and I think this is probably one of the key issues I see, is that relationship breakdowns, that one parent, you get this really common phenomena where, let's slip into sort of lazy stereotypes. Dad looks at mum, and mum is kind of soft and compassionate. Mum maybe does see some of the additional needs and is a bit more lenient, will avoid conflict and be a bit more, you know, which I think is a good, that a bit more creative and a bit more compassionate, a bit more pastoral. And Dad looks and he goes, well, you're just soft. This, you know, sooner or later, this child has to get a job. Dads are often looking to the future. This child has to get a job. How are they going to function in the world? How are they going to function if a policeman stops them in the street? They need to understand discipline. So Dad tightens the screws and Mam loosens off the screws. And Mam looks at Dad. So this is gender stereotypes, you know, and mams and dads and dads, you know, so just forgive my shortcut language. Mum looks at Dad and goes, he's turning into a camp commandant. He needs to know that my kid is, our child is vulnerable. They've got additional needs. They've got, complex view of themselves and the world they live in. And that's why I'm being compassionate and empathic and trying to have a low demand environment and, all of that. And so she says, well, I'm loosening the screws. And Dad goes, you've loosened the screws. I better tighten the screws. And they're just this ping pong. And in the middle, children, I think children are very, children can absorb all of that. But what it means is that a house divided, that you're never going to be able to address issues because you can't agree on what the issues are. And, working with families where, one of the things an NVR approach would say, right, list all the stuff that is going on and together as a family, as a couple, agree on what you need to change. And that can often be the biggest challenge in any sort of intervention because they can't. And as I say again, that often I worked with one kinship carer, and the amount of pressure that she was under from her other biological, she was caring for her grandchild, but the pressure from her other biological children to parent a certain way, causing enormous stress and strain on her, and all of the time this spectre of children's social services hovering over her, because that was, that was what has got us. That is what got us here in the first place. So really complicated that families are just, there's all this other stuff going around because, I'm sure, there's however many people on this call, but actually the reality is that none of us would want a social worker knocking on our front door uninvited. We don't have to have a huge amount of empathy or compassion to think, what is that like? And children who are incredibly vulnerable, again, the caveat being all children are vulnerable, but have the ability to make the people around them equally as vulnerable. So a child who will make an allegation, a child who'll say, again, work with a lot of families. And again, I think that I'm going to stop sharing because I'm bored of looking at my slides. I'll send all the slides through. Again, so I think that's where you've got very different experiences. So adopters have got this notion that social workers are good, and I think social workers are good. So they're like, hey, come on in. And social workers coming in and going, whoa, they're not the same social worker. A child protection or early help social worker is not a post-adoption support social worker, and families finding themselves they're not in Kansas anymore. This is a really different place. And I think also that services realizing that actually no one's that interested in your opinion because your child is saying X, Y, and Z. And again, children who've got really complicated perceptions of themselves, children who we often talk about child-centered practice, which is great, but actually that's not how any of us live our lives. In real terms is that we operate as communities and families around children, that we make sure we prioritize the needs of our children and we ensure their needs are being met. But we make decisions in our family life in terms of what's best for the family. And then we may have to compromise one to get kind of for us the whole thing. But often social care can come in and it's about, my daughter saying, well, if they were just a bit more reasonable. And me like having eyes on stocks, my children have been, I'm trying to think. It's not a competition, but I was removed from my house for 11 days at one point when my daughter accused me of trying to kill her. I hadn't, just to be clear. And the laddo agreed with me, both laddos. But actually terrifying because seeing my daughter actually feeling a sense of potency, but also feeling out of control. And it's really complicated dynamics, and kinship carers wanting to have nothing to do with social workers for all obvious reasons, or being natural. Not that's overstating. Maybe being naturally cautious, where adoptive parents aren't naturally cautious. People having very different experiences of social care professionals in terms of what people what you're going to get when you make the call for help. And again, with the police, it was fascinating talking to the police because I undertook some interviews with police officers who've been attended call outs, and it's easy to kind of fall into Lizzie stereotypes. So the first one I met had this incredibly empathic, compassionate understanding of the nature of the challenges that pet families were facing. And actually, the other that I met, and I interviewed another one who was quite a bit more, LOL, what's going on here? And he was a bit, but then when you scratch beneath the surface, exactly the same, just really understood the difficulties, but also frustrations that the only place you can get help at 5 o'clock on a Saturday night is the police. I feel like I've talked about loads of different stuff. I'm not sure that I've got to any sort of coherent conclusion. I think that what we see is ultimately is that families find themselves incredibly isolated, that they don't want to talk, that the mental health, when, you know, the studies that we did, the mental health of the adults was catastrophically poor oftentimes, that their relationships suffered, lots of separated families, lots of burdens falling on mums, you know, being blunt. There's a high level of stigma and shame, and people just, you know, I'm sure you've all gone into houses where the seven bells has been knocked out of the property. But that being a red flag in of itself, because you know, normally you would go in and go, well, this is no place for a child to live, and then saying, well, I can fix the door, but it'll be broken again, and I haven't got £80 for £100 or 200, whatever. I can fix the hole in the wall. I can fix the telly. Really complicated dynamics that are overlaid by adopters' experience. I think adoption is, sort of in conclusion, because I'm looking at the time, as I say, I can go on and on. I think adopters have probably got the best of services in terms of the Adoption Support Fund, which has accessed a lot of NVR. I think it's a lot of people been on it, if I'm being honest. I think a lot of people have been through a half-day induction into NVR and said, oh, it's not for me. But in its sort of, in its truest sense, NVR is very much a systemic family therapeutic intervention, which I think is what we all see as the solution, which is the question at the beginning was what's going on, and it's just like everyone's got a different view. Any more questions? I can kind of just talk and talk. You've hit a rich vein of passion, so I will just keep going.
I mean, yeah, I'm just sitting here loving hearing you talk about it. We do have a few more questions though.
Right. While you collate them, I've got so we did ask people. This is the final thing we did in the surveys, was we asked people what do you want? What do you want? And so I'll read these out. So there was one parent said, just belief that this is really happening. Just believe me. Believe the parents and not blame them. Acknowledge that it happens. Non-judgmental advice, less blame, anything, and understanding. So I think families are really realistic about how complicated this is. You know, everyone wants a silver bullet, but there aren't any. So yeah.
Can I just come back to you about one of the things that I talk a lot with parents about validation and recognizing the difficulty that a child faces, because 99 times out of 100 there is a reason, there is some difficulty that a child is facing or has faced that is the visible, and you see the visible part of that through that behavior, and often it's a nice way, when talking about that, the validating their experience, recognizing the difficulty they're facing. It's quite a nice, they could then recognize the difference it can make to them, then they can then make that difference to their child as well by looking at that difficulty and saying, oh, I can only imagine how hard that is, believing in your child's difficulty, recognizing that struggle. But it is so important that we do understand, and we do believe in what parents are saying. Parents saying, oh, I've had to film my child. I don't have to. You don't have to do that. Don't do that. I believe you. I understand what you're going through. It's but yeah,
it's fascinating. There's a question there I'm reading as you were talking. Julie M said, do you have advice on how to get past the professionals' blame culture opinion to actually access help and support? Well, I guess part of my story is that I saw the writing on the wall in 2008 and thought I need to be system literate. So I think that oftentimes I work with parents in terms of how to work with professionals, because I think especially adopters, I think have got this. So adopters are an unusual cohort in terms of they tend to be a little bit better off, maybe from a slightly different class, maybe different levels of education than the wider population, tend to be a bit older. So I think the danger for adoptive parents is that they come in, and oftentimes adoptive parents have read every single book. So you go into their home and you go, well, did it? And they go, I know that, I've read it. What can you bring to this party? So I think one of the things I tell people is, if you are dealing with professionals, you tool up, you get ready, you take, I say to all my families, take a notebook into meetings, take minutes of the meetings. The one thing that we always did was we articulated about the needs of the family and tried to not, again, I think professionals are hypersensitive to people calling their kids names. So we didn't call, not that I call my daughter names, but articulate it in a way that talks about her vulnerability. And this sort of spilled into a couple of my other children, but talk about terms about articulating your vulnerability of your child and the impact on you. If someone comes to you and goes, they just won't do as they're told, that's kind of a dead end conversation. So kind of trying to help professionals make sense of it, and also shake the dust off your feet. If you're not getting what you need out of a professional, find someone who can. So, but that is, I mean, as I say, I was really conscious that we need to become system literate, and things like the domestic homicide review of Sarah, which I don't know if people have read, which is absolutely awful. And that was local to us. That was 5 miles from where I live. So the social work team that were involved with us literally would be involved with that. But also share information with people, and more professionals. It's just terrifying. To be honest with you, most people are just not equipped for this. You know, you come into this bowl of spaghetti and go, where the heck do I start? I'll start with the parent, because they're the one that'll talk to me. And then parents' default position is blame. So then that's a quick answer to that question. You can people can connect with me in private through the info@al.codes.uk, also Facebook and Twitter and X, and I do answer messages and that sort of thing. Sorry.
We've got a couple more questions, Al.
Yeah.
We have a question: where can we find more about the insights and findings from your work with the police? I guess there'll be links to that on your website, will there? Or
yeah, if you go to alcourts.co.uk, on the left hand drop down, there's links to it, and you have to download it from academia.edu, but it's free. Yeah, so you can download that. And I'm like dog muck, as my mother would say. I get everywhere. So if you don't have to Google me too far, the 2018 survey, there was 3. Again, that's all on academia.edu. So that if you start on my website, you'll not go too far wrong.
All right, thanks. Another question: given that adoption and special guardianship support fund is also available to SGO carers, what comes across as the challenges to take up? I can't see this bit here.
Yeah, I think I know what they're saying.
The challenges for take up of support in the same way that adopters take it up.
Well, I think that one of the challenges is that people dust their feet off and don't want anything to do with social workers. I think if you're an SGO, that's a broad generalization, but I think that people have not necessarily had great experiences like adopters.
Yeah.
You know, it's like adopters, it's come on in, eat some biscuits. It's lovely, you know, it's a totally different paradigm in terms of how they think about adoption support. But also there's an element of, you know, you gave me these kids, so you're going to help me look after them, which I think is totally healthy to a point. But I think as a kinship carer, you're probably battered and bruised before you even start.
Yeah.
And I think that gives you a reluctance to open the door. Social workers can be a bit like vampires, if you'll pardon my French, but, you know, once you invite them in, they're always in. You know, an example of can I give an example, which I did work with as a grandparent whose child was violent aggressive. And we were talking about her morning routine. So she would say, well, first thing in the morning, you know, we were talking about what you would like to change. You know, we were doing the baskets in terms of what is the priority. And she said, teeth cleaning. I want him to clean his teeth. She had a sort of 7-year-old with violent, aggressive, challenging behavior. And she said, I was like, you've talked about hitting, kicking, spitting, breaking, effing and jeffing, and you want him to clean his teeth. I was like, it makes sense that to me. And she went, well, in the mornings he gets up and I'll tell him to clean his teeth, and he won't clean his teeth. So I clean his teeth for him. And I thought, well, we all know what, if you try and clean the teeth of a 7-year-old against their will, we're in a complicated area in terms of who is violent, who's being violent, because that's quite, yeah. And then she said, no, he won't get dressed and he comes to school, and, you know, when he goes to school, he gets picked up and he gets taken and he arranges school in an absolute rage, and the mornings are awful. And then the same again at night, he won't clean his teeth. And when you unpicked it, actually, what the real concern was that she was terrified of school reporting him for being unkempt. because that's how it all started. You know, the school had said, you know, to when he was not living with her. And so actually the sort of this very unique pressure was creating this set of circumstances. And we took the pressure off. He was, you know, certainly we're not saying it's a wonder cure, but we said, well, the school said, look, it's fine. If he doesn't clean his teeth, it's fine. We're not going to, we're not going to ring anyone. We know that, you know, have you got toothpaste yet? Have you got a toothbrush yet? Do you remind him? Yeah. Well, that's as much as you can do, because we're into big philosophical questions, aren't we? In terms of, can you make children do things? Question. So, but also, are we responsible for our children's behavior? So that's a question that we often mull over in the groups I do. I go, right, so are you responsible? And, you know, someone's just put there, professionals tend to have a expert model approach to their work, but need to listen and learn from lived experience. Absolutely. And I think that for me, one of the key issues around this is peer support, because if you're talking about children with hidden disabilities and children with complex biographies and life stories, that stuff isn't going to be changed by a parenting. You can't change child by just being better boundaries or more. So sometimes it's about creating a world where children can continue to thrive, that there's reasonable limits and bounds to their life, and that they live in harmony, because actually living in a place where they feel loved and are loved, and parents feel that that's reciprocated, that is more important than getting your GCSEs. So sue me if you think that. But for some of our children, that's not an option. And so parents are dancing to a tune that someone else is playing when their child, you know, you can get your GCSEs at 25. That's maybe a controversial comment, and I'm happy to defend it. So I think that parents and carers, there's a lot of pressure on them to operate a certain way. And oftentimes that's just not helping their child.
That expectation, isn't it? That pressure that builds. Yeah, there's often that in the mix. I'm just thinking if we have any more questions.
Jane says you've got to do the feedback sheet.
Yeah, so we have Jane has been putting in the chat, and we have a feedback sheet, that an evaluation form. It's really quick, just takes a couple of minutes, but we really appreciate it if you could fill that in. It means that, you know, we're more able to get an idea of what's useful for you, and we can do more of these events, and things that are, like I say, more useful for you. So if you could do that before you leave, that would be great. I wonder if there's any sort of final thoughts or anything else that you...
Honestly, if you start me off again, I'll go for another 2 hours. It's quite a problem. No, I think ultimately there's so many arguments. It feels like we're at the beginning of learning in terms of this. I think my concern is that we sort of characterize this as one thing when it just feels like there's lots of different things going on. And I think, being cynical, I think there's money to be made in this world. You know, if I had the book that said I'm going to fix it for you, I know it'd be a bestseller, because there's so many. So I think that it's having that open mind, and like Jane was saying there, Jane Boland, that it's having that ability to listen. And it's old-fashioned skills. It's the old-fashioned professional skills. It's about listening, not with an answer already in our heads. It's about compassion and empathy. And because parents and carers know it's complicated. I don't think, I mean, some do. Most people understand that there is not going to be an easy solution. Because they've tried everything. That's why they're at your door. They've tried all these simple solutions.
Yeah, if it was easy, they wouldn't need you, would they? So
exactly, yeah.
Yeah. We have we've got time for there's a couple of questions.
Yeah.
I think we're going till 2. Is that all right?
That's fine, yeah.
Yeah. So we've got a question. How useful is OMA's NVR model in this process? You've mentioned it a couple of times, but I'm not sure your thoughts regarding it.
Well, it's not a silver bullet. I think that's the key thing, is that I think there's aspects of it that are really helpful for supporting parents and carers and helping move their thinking. But if you've got a child, I think we've not even talked about mental ill health. I think even that, when we talk about the underlying causes, some children really quite poorly. And, you know, you wouldn't, it's not how you would treat adult mental health. You would support the individual and kind of see that their behavior is a manifestation of that ill health. So I think that we need to support parents. I think NVR is a fantastic tool for helping families to look at how they're parenting.
Mm.
And I think it's got the potential to transform families. But I do think that doesn't necessarily mean that you will see changes in children's behavior. What you might see is you adjust the system to be able to manage and tolerate that behavior or keep a child safe. I think in some cases it's enough, because sometimes you see people, especially adoptive parents, who can sometimes get overly pastoral, you know, can be like, they can be overwhelmed by a child's story. And sometimes children just need to be given really, you know, and sometimes it can help adjust that parenting model. And sometimes, you know, people are parenting like it's 1975 and it ain't. And so NVR is a route into that. It's just systemic family therapy, really. But the nice thing about NVR is it doesn't need a child to play nicely. It doesn't need a child to be involved.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a place for things like the solution-based therapies. I think working directly with children and young people, most of the children and young people I work with, it's not necessarily within their gift to behave differently. And that is really complicated, because you've got a child who's reactive, who's incredibly vulnerable, who's autistic or got sensory needs. You know, not that all children like that have got those additional needs behave this way, but
No, but it impacts, yeah.
Yes. So I think NVR does work. I find it fascinating. I don't think it's the silver bullet that we're looking for, though. And I don't think it's right for a lot of people, because actually I've worked with people and I've thought you're not prepared to embrace the change that I am suggesting.
Yeah.
But it's got the opportunity to reset relationships within the family. It's also support. It's about, I think that some of the stuff around NVR is about building support, not just looking at your existing network and going, well, Anthony Maud might be able to help. It's about going, right, I need someone who's going to do something really specific to support us as a family. At times, I think organically we got there in terms of me becoming a social worker and surrounding myself with social workers, police, legal experts. That was just fortuitous and just, but yeah, people who are system literate. I've got friends, and oftentimes, I've got a friend who's a fantastic NVR therapist, but ringing me up going, this social worker's freaked out. What do I say to them? You go, right, you need to wind your language down, because you're escalating the people who can help you navigate the system. And also, I think we need advocates, people who will come and sit in a room with you and go, Sue is freaked out today, but can I tell you what I've seen? Or Bob is having a breakdown. Bob can't tell you, you still people who are just overwhelmed by their experience that they can't articulate, or they're not very good at articulating because they're not system literate in a way that I am, and you are. And, I know there's things I would say to a social worker that will raise red flags and take this conversation in a totally different way. But I also know there's a way of describing things in a way that de-escalates everyone in the system. And they can hear it, and they can also see that I haven't lost the plot. Sometimes I have lost the plot, though.
We all get there at times. We all get there at times. So I think at the top of this, Al, we were seeing if you were going to be worthy, your talk was going to be worthy of the accolades and the praise that I was lining up for the start of it. And I really think it was. I think it was
thank you.
Such not only informative, interesting, but entertaining and enjoyable as well. So thank you. So
I've got some stories.
It's been great, and I think we're getting a lot of good feedback here as well.
Thank you. That's positive.
Thanks for all your very, very thought-provoking and useful. A lot of people really enjoying it, so that's brilliant. There's one last question that I mean, I'm just, it's quite a big one, so I'm not sure we've got time for it, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it came in, and that's seems respectful. But it's just what's your advice on supporting children who are being violent or aggressive Sorry, this may be too late, but I guess that's the whole.
Well, I think that the stuff that Bruce Perry uses, like the triple R, which is regulate, relate, reason. I think that's for me, you've got to pick your moments with children. And also, you know, we're not talking about shame. I do often in the sessions I do, I talk an awful lot about shame, because I think shame is a huge driver of challenging behavior. And so I think that you've got to get to a place where you can have sort of meaningful conversations around what's going on in children's world. The story with me and my daughter and the football is that ultimately on the drive on the way home, like 6 hours later, after she'd ripped a shred off me, and I stepped back, I didn't do anything, but I was burned, you know, I was like, oof. She was able to articulate why she did that in a way that was natural and organic, and she didn't feel any shame. And we were able to come to a way of us not getting there again. Because and it was totally reasonable adjustments. It was like she said, look, I feel this way when you shout out at a football pitch, which other children would feel to number 1%, she feels to 1,000%. And so it is about creating an environment where children can speak freely, and it's without blame or shame, but also about trying to change children's behavior and say, well, how can we not get there? What can we do differently? But also teaching children to regulate away from moments of stress.
Yeah.
So let's practice regulating on a day when you're regulated. It's stuff like that makes, you know, rather than like, now would be a good time to start breathing heavily. You know, we all need to breathe heavily. So it's just some of that practical stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, I'm sure, you know, people want to go to your website, they can, like you said, they can get in contact with you. But I think that's all we've got time for today, guys. So really appreciate you all
Thank
being
you.
with us. And really appreciate, obviously, you know, Al, for your time, your expertise, your you know, it's been really, like I said earlier, really interesting, really useful, but really entertaining and just enjoyable as well. So thank you very much. For everyone else still here, if you haven't, please do fill out the form that Jane has put in the chat. It's really useful for us to have that evaluation form completed. And I hope you've all found it useful. Good luck with the rest of your day. And thanks for being here. Any questions, anything else you need, you know, you can get in contact with us at Capa. I know you can get in contact with Al as well. So thank you, and we hope to see you again on our next event, perhaps.
Perfect. Thank you very much.